Hey guys, Paul from Radperformance. Today we're going to be disassembling another Rochester. This one happens to be from the early 80s. A lot of these were the electronic version of the Quadrajet 4 barrels. This one happens to come off of a small block Chevy. They use them a lot, 305s and 350s, various cars. A lot of the Chevys ended up in different vehicles, Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, even the Cadillacs had the 305s and 350s. These carburetors normally were a lot where you had them on the Camaros and the trucks and vans. So normally I wouldn't overhaul these for anything performance. With the electronic metering rods and the electronic throttle position sensor that they have built in, these work in conjunction with the electronic HEI that was in these vehicles. So it was very an early stage of the computer system that tried to help with the idle pollution. Nowadays, we can get a Rochester or any other carburetor. You tune up a small block Chevy, you can run way cleaner than what they used to do, especially nowadays. To get these electronic pieces and to tune them, you'll just chase your tail, I feel. But a lot of good parts in these. If you don't pass them up at a swap meet, you still can use the electric choke. You have the pull-off still, which really we're not going to worry about. The throttle base is a Chevy throttle base. It has the kick down for the transmissions, the 700s and the 350s. So you're good with that. It has the built-in throttle spring return, and then the throttle cable that were on all Chevys. So this is a good piece right here, just for the throttle plate. It would be a good score if it was reasonably cheap at the swap meet. We're going to start the disassembly, and then I just really wanted to show you that. This will be a teardown of the electronic Quadrajet 4-barrel. So we'll get started with that. First thing is, these have Torx screws, so we're going to have to use a Torx instead of a flathead for those vehicles. They went with Torx screw heads. You have your hat that has the perimeter. You'll see all these screws, and there are two down in the primary throttle bore. Again, Torx. So let me get my magnet, just in case one gets away from me. Got my magnet here in case one gets away. We have our accelerator pump that normally there's a roll pin that you can knock out with a 3/32 punch. A lot of guys they may use a nail or a hardened screw. I think it's just easy enough. Get yourself a real punch. It just saves yourself stress, and it could be used as an alignment when you're putting it back in to not risk breaking off the tab on these. One thing is, if you do have the roll pin where you're going to punch it through, do not let it hit the air horn. Always leave enough room that you can fit the flathead of a screwdriver in the behind. Then you could pry it back in alignment. It'll save you a lot of stress when you're going to put it back. You'll have to fish with the needle nose to try to get it again. Just don't bury it back until you hit that. Always leave a little bit of space. So this one happens to have a cotter pin that goes through. So we're going to have to pull this cotter pin out. Just flatten it out back here. So let's see what we get. There's a cotter pin on this. Okay. There we go. And like I said, it's just enough to need to go a little bit more. Like I said, I'm always leaving room in the back here. Just leave enough room that you can still get a screwdriver in the back. This one seems to have a lot of caked up dirt on it. Okay. I just saw the accelerator pump rock. Okay, yeah, this has a lot of, so. Here is your accelerator lever. You have the rod here that goes to the throttle. We'll see what this piece is here. This goes to the accelerator pump for the throttle position sensor. It goes right into the housing below the lever. Put all our parts in here. And the cotter pin. Jeez, my screwdriver. I'm going to take the secondary hanger out. This saves you stress when you're taking the air horn on and off, because these rods hang through the carburetor. So you got your little screw here. We'll slide out the metering rods. Okay, most of these on these cars, these are super thick metering rods. I'll just keep them, but I probably won't use them. This is an O hanger. The letter on the hanger dictates the orientation of the hole. So this is a pretty high up, which I kind of like. Depending on what, the higher it is, the higher the hole is, the higher the metering rods, the secondary metering rods, when they're open, it will lift them out of the bore more fuel. So the higher the hole, the richer it would be, or the thinner the metering rods, the richer it would be. So if you have a high hanger and thin metering rods, then you have a richer mixture, wide open throttle. So that would be your goal if you're doing some type of performance out on the street, rather than just using what factory did. Factory was always conservative. Most of the time factory, these metering rods are always chubby. They have a little fat piece and you have that little tip. That goes into the throttle board down here, and it plugs the metering holes. The rear on the Rochester doesn't have jets, just the primary. This literally has an orifice that it goes into, and then you change it with the metering rods. So we got that out of the way. We don't have to worry about it. We're going to start going around to the screws. So we're going to crack them all loose so we can get to it. These were actually not that tight at all. Okay, so these look good. Remember, you got two in the primary throttle bore. Just take them out. Okay, I will take off this primary choke pull-off that goes to the side, but it actually blocks, when it's cold, the secondary doors from opening. So you want to take that off because it's bolted to this top lid. Again, we're going to crack it loose. And this choke pull-off goes right to a vacuum source. You'll probably always see these. A lot of times there'll be a secondary back here. Works with the choke also. It'll block the secondary doors here. Neither one, I mean, you can use one. It depends on the vehicle. They would use both. One is enough, and honestly, any type of performance use, you wouldn't use it anyway. Okay, we just save this. This will be your choke pull-off. We take the vacuum hose, leave it with the throttle rod assembly. You can put it back. This one held vacuum. Squeeze it in, hold the vacuum, and it holds it. If not, you would check it here if you think this is compromised. You should hold it. It should hold vacuum in. You could even hear it on this that it holds the vacuum in. And we'll continue to go around. Most of these screws here are going to be the same, except the ones right here that go all the way through. I think this guy just has good. Yeah, he's not coming out, so I'll have to. These are the long boys. They go through the main bore into the lower. And then the throttle bore into the main bore are from the bottom. So these are your screws here. Let's get the magnet. That's why I always keep it. And grab these screws here. You got the tapered screws. Always tapered in the primary jet side. This side was stuck. Here we go. And here's the other screw. So normally it's 9 or 11. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then you have 10, 11. 9 on the outside and 2 in the middle there. Oh, and I got these 2 here for the air deflator for the primary. So these 2 here will go. I like to keep the little the deflector plate and put it back. A lot of times they won't even put them back. It definitely works as it's flowing, especially if you have a ram air intake and it's pushing air in. It just keeps the fuel from splashing into the secondaries. So same screws for that. I'll put that with this right here. Okay. So now we got this. We pretty much should be good. We have to take this choke rod, which they didn't change that, so that's still a flathead. So we'll take this out. Flathead screw for this. Should just crack right off. Very good. This is a lever and it goes right to the choke. And this guy should pop right off. And this rod will go through the case, so there you go for that. Get a bigger screwdriver for this. There you go. So it cracked up. Okay. And I'm more curious. This did come off a running car as far as I know. So I'm more curious to see about the parts inside. So just when you're lifting off the air horn and you have this choke bracket off, this rod will hang up. Just let the rod fall right in the hole, and then you'll be able to pull it right out. And then the gasket should just want to stay. So, and there you go. So the idle tubes on this fell out, so they're. I want to show you that while it's in there. You have 2 idle restrictor tubes here, and there were 2 others right here. And these are sitting in the bowl, so they should be pressed in right here. And you could just tap them in. I normally do it with a brass drift. So there you go. These will be different from the late 70s and then going back. You see there's a lot of added items here that work with the throttle position and with these metering rods. Sadly, you really couldn't use this for those vehicles. You really would be at a loss. You really couldn't. So we'll take this out. On these carburetors, these carburetors, you have a lot of extra rubber gaskets, and this feels very, the best word would be with today's fuel, these were built, there was no oxygenated fuel on the market. These swell, almost as if you dipped it in brake fluid and left it. And this is the issue. So most of the kits, and they have a lot of guys that make good kits on the market, especially with the accelerator pump. They have all upgraded seals and seats, especially on the accelerator pump. This gets brittle and dries out. Even on the Hollies it happens to. You have to get newer materials for the accelerator pump gasket here, the O-ring, and these rubber O-rings. Always look for a high quality. You really can't even use, if you have an old kit from like the 90s, I wouldn't recommend using it. You would get something newer that it's for today's fuel. And you could overhaul this or just get a whole new accelerator pump. But these would all have to be changed. So here is your throttle position sensor. These can get replaced. The problem with these are tuned out of the factory. When you replace this, especially this throttle position sensor, there's a plug down below that needs to be knocked out, that the new one will have an adjustment. So unless you're doing restoration on, let's say, an 80s car, it could be an old 442, the 80s, a Monte Carlo Super Sport, something that you really wanted to keep it original and keep this carburetor, more power to you for that if you want to keep it all original. I don't see the cost benefit with it. You're just going to chase your tail trying to get those parts and tuning it. If these things work, you put an ohm meter. It all works on ohms. All the electronics, even today on a brand new 2023 vehicle, just electricity, works on ohms. There's no secret sauce, no rocket science that everyone wants you to think, the dealership. They don't even know, which is sad. It's all ohms. You put an ohm meter, this will change with ohms, and you'll get readings. And you can you'll have to find out the specs. You get the online Chilton. They'll tell you what the specs are, open and closed or mid. Just like the old fuel gauges, it's 0 to 90 ohms. 0, 90 is full, 0 is empty. Somewhere in between is half tank. That's all it works on. All these things work on that, and you would get a reading. If you have infinity, you put it on and there's no continuity, then you know it's bad. If you're getting a reading and you vary it, then it still works. You can just put it back in, and it'll work for what you did, and it'll be for that car, and GM tuned it. Just be happy with it and go down the road. Normally your issue is going to be with the metering rods working with the distributor, so the harness comes and it goes back to the 4-wire hookup on the distributor. It's not the mechanical advance, it's all electronic, and that's what meters it. This carburetor, I knew it wasn't working right because it was dumping fuel at idle. It was just dumping the fuel. It ran, it was fine, but it just spewed smoke. So we're going to go not electronic, and it's going to run a lot better. So we are actually making the car more green by cleaning it up to what it is now. After all these years, obviously, I give this carburetor credit. It held on. The way it looks, I don't even think this carburetor was ever touched. It's probably original. The vehicle didn't have that many miles. Phillips screw holds in the metering rods, the electronic. So this is in the electronic, and it triggers the metering rods in here. That I'll show you. We'll take the baffle off to the float. It's a little stubborn. Get our pick tool. Just always be delicate. This is like a phenolic piece, and with today's fuel, a lot of these things get brittle, so don't manhandle it as you're taking it out. So yeah, This is unbelievable. This still has the float, the needle and seat on the float is correct. I believe this is original. I don't think anyone touched this carburetor, which is beautiful. Yep, it's just crud. And the oxygenated gas just makes everything corrode. And that's the problem with it. Okay. And these here are the metering rods that would work electronically up and down with this, rather than the vacuum working with it. It would be vacuum and the electronics that make it cycle the fuel. So when these things don't work, the needles, the metering rods, the primary meter will just hop and dump fuel. And you have the idle passages right here too. So this is a 750 Rochester. I don't think they ever made 800s in the 80s. All that was only in the 70s really. So as a carburetor base, this electronic base and the top air horn, I'm not reusing it. I'm going to really go after the throttle plate, because that's why I wanted this carburetor for. And all this other stuff I have no business keeping. Because if you can't get it to work the way they did it at the factory, then you're just wasting gas and blowing emissions, and there's no benefit. So for right now, let me see, I don't want to dump this out right here. I still have fuel in it, which tells me that the well plugs were doing their job, that it wasn't even leaking out of the well plugs. A lot of dirt in this, I'll tell you that, man, a lot of dirt, which I can't even argue with it. So we have 3 screws back here that hold this on. They hold this guy on the bottom. Let's take all these plugs out. Just looking to see. Yes, it was touched. Yep. This, if I reuse it, it's very dirty, and it looks to me that the throttle stop, it's already buried and just not quite 90. So this I would adjust here. You always want these to be dead at 90, not over, just always dead at 90.